Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo. Joining Father Bacik in today's reflections is Susan Haar, a freelance writer and teacher at Owens Technical College and at Lourdes College. Today, Father Bacik and Susan Haar discuss the ordination of women in the Church. Here is Father Bacik.
Susan, I think it would be good if you and I had some serious conversation. I think this whole idea of doing this program together developed when I was invited to a group that you belong to, a group of women who are interested in the ordination of women in the Catholic Church. And as I recall it, you invited me to the group with the proviso that I would just sit there and not talk, which I thought was a rather interesting situation to be in. And as a matter of fact, I guess you did let me talk after your general discussion was over. But I consider that to be a valuable experience because it enabled me to listen to what women who are serious about the question of ordination of women in the Catholic Church are thinking and saying, to feel perhaps some of the frustration and pain that's involved with that, and to know something of your hopes and desires along that line. So I think I was brought in as perhaps a sympathetic observer, and I think that was a good experience for me. And perhaps we can therefore use that whole idea as the basis of our discussion of women's ordination.
Okay. I should point out that our group is not closed to men. It just so happens at this point the members of the group are all women.
Well, that's strange, Susan. Why is that?
I don't know. I guess because we began this fall after I and another member of the group had attended the Women's Ordination Conference in Cleveland that was held this past fall. And we decided that we felt a discussion group in the Toledo Diocese would be valuable. So we began just contacting other friends of ours who had at some point expressed interest and started passing the word around that this group would form. That is how we got our initial membership, and as it happened, those were all women. Now I suppose partly this may not be attractive to men because men can be ordained if they so choose to be, so why fight somebody else's battle? I do know that at the Cleveland meeting there were men in attendance, and some are very active in the Cleveland Diocese and some of the other Eastern Ohio dioceses in the women's ordination movement. And I spoke to one man out of interest. I asked him, why are you so involved here? And he said, well, as a married man, I cannot be ordained either. And he felt that by working for the opening up of the ministry, there would be more options for him as well. So he and his wife were both involved.
You see, was this a meeting in Cleveland a regional meeting?
Yes, it was a regional meeting. I don't believe a national meeting was held this year. Only regional meetings for the regional areas to get going more within their region.
Do you have any sense of the overall situation in the Catholic Church in the United States on this? I mean, how large a membership there is in this group, and how many people are actively involved? I don't know if that's really a fair question, but do you have any general assessment of what's going on with it?
The feeling that I got was that actually the regional groups are more organized than the national group right now. Various regions have really taken off with it and have some solid groups of people of anywhere from 20 to maybe, now I'm only guessing, maybe 50 people who are actively meeting, working, and planning. things from protests to just discussions to consciousness-raising newsletters and things like that, planning educational programs that could be used in schools. So there's a real variety. As far as I know, in the Toledo Diocese, not much is happening now, and that's why we felt we would start a discussion group.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was happy to be with you. I found it interesting, and I thought that people had done their homework well and so on.
Yes.
I think that as I begin to look at the question, I suppose I do it as a theologian, and one has to go back to our roots on all of this. And
yes.
One of the things that you often hear is that women can't be ordained because there were no women in the original grouping of 12 that Jesus chose. And I know that that is a powerful argument for many people. It's like, well, women have never been ordained, and therefore they had no real role in the early church, and therefore they shouldn't have any role now. And I think that the biblical scholars have really done a lot of work on this and investigated this question in great detail and have submitted reports on it and so on. I've talked to some of them that have been involved in that study in Rome, Father David Stanley for one, a biblical scholar. And I know the conclusions that come out from that biblical study on, as they see it, is that there really is no biblical basis for denying ordination to women.
Yes.
That what we're dealing with is a cultural situation that we have to recognize at the time of Jesus, that indeed he was in a totally patriarchal, sexist culture.
Yes.
Women were really denied their rights in so many ways. And even religiously, women were not to partake in the general religious discussion of things. Women were kept illiterate. Women were really in a servant kind of capacity and had no real role to play in leadership in that culture or in the religious setting of that time. And therefore, Jesus was living in that culture and had certain constraints going upon him. But you can look, another way of saying it is that, well, Jesus chose all Jewish people, too,
yes.
as part of his apostles, and yet we didn't stay fixed at that level.
Right,
we
that was
eventually
a major
allowed
argument.
Gentiles to become priests. That was the whole significance of the Council of Jerusalem in the year 49 and Paul's great effort to expand Christianity away from being just a sect within Judaism to having a more universal role. So when the challenge came to whether we were going to just ordain Jewish people, it was broken through and we moved to the position of ordaining Gentile people. So if you went on that general rule that whatever Jesus did is totally normative in that way, well, then we'd have to have all Jewish people as priests.
Yes.
So I think that argument largely falls, and of course there's a lot of other biblical material that would have to be brought into that discussion. But do you want to stay with that for just a minute?
Yes, I think we could talk about that a little more. I agree with you that that argument falls. Actually, none of us, men or women, could really imitate the 12 because they were with Jesus throughout his ministry, and none of us have that opportunity to go back, experience his baptism, and by John, and then go through his whole ministry. Paul, although he's often taken to speak against women, I think does offer, in a way, through his life, something that might help the women's movement, and that is that God can call people who are unexpected. The apostles certainly did not expect someone like Paul. Paul himself did not expect to be called, and yet he was called by God to this ministry, and Paul had to fight on the behalf of the Gentiles, the others, to be admitted. So I think we have to recognize that God, if we're a prophetic people, moving our lives and our history as a journey towards God, that God may call other people that we don't expect because of our cultural situation. Now, some people may, of course, be off track. They may think they are being called by God, but may be deluded. But I think the testimony of so many women who feel this call is showing us that, indeed, the Spirit or God is calling these women to use their talents.
And I think that we go back to the Bible, as you well put, to see in Paul himself a more positive outlook on women. I think it's important to realize that Paul called women in his own time co-workers.
Yes.
And we look in the last chapter of Romans, we find talk of people who have worked with him. There's even a use of a particular phrase in that letter to the Romans where a woman is called an apostle.
Yes.
You've got to remember that the word apostle is much broader than 12. I think you put that very well. The 12 were the primitive witnesses to what Jesus had done, the founding figures, because they were with him, knew him personally. But the word apostle has a wider ranging meaning, so that Paul was an apostle and Barnabas was an apostle, and evidently there was even a woman who was considered to be an apostle, or that Paul denominated her in that way. We also know that there were deaconesses used in the early church.
Yes.
That was especially in conjunction with baptism, where the adult to be baptized would go down into a pool of water and would then be clothed in the new white garments, and women deaconesses often functioned in that role of sponsor or help to the women involved. So I think that perhaps that helps to give us a little clearer picture of what's going on in the Bible. And then there's always that great phrase from Paul that in Christ there's neither slave nor free person, male or female.
Right.
And I think that really needs to be highlighted here, that biology really isn't the total thing in the scriptural understanding. Jesus often said that he moved away from biology. It's not just the mother who nursed the baby who really counts. It's not that biological factor, or that you're descendants from Abraham biologically. It's what's in the heart that Jesus suggests.
Yes.
Who's my brothers and my sisters are those who are willing to respond to the Word of God. That's what creates the community, the call of the Spirit. So there again, I think we see biblical basis that would help to put this question in better perspective.
I think if we keep in mind that the cultural situation at Jesus' time, we can see that he really did move beyond that in inviting women to speak with him. Culturally, women were not expected to speak with the rabbi. You know, the men should sit with the rabbi and then, I suppose, tell the women later on, if they so chose to, what was said. But Jesus frequently talked with women. With the Samaritan woman, really served in the broader sense as his disciple to the rest of the Samaritans at that town. He encouraged Mary and Martha. He encouraged Mary to sit and talk with him as the men would, sit and talk with the rabbi. The women, Luke does talk about women traveling with Jesus. I think it's in the beginning of chapter 8. And, of course, the women were at the tomb to witness the resurrection and to begin spreading the word of that. So in many ways, Jesus really did reach out to women beyond what was culturally expected. We don't recognize that without knowing some of the history, because the things he did seem to us sort of minimal, you know, from the standpoint of being involved in an age where there's some liberation going on. But if we see it in perspective, then again, I think it gives us some hope for the Christian tradition to help us in this respect instead of hinder us.
Yeah, I think that's well put, that you have to see Jesus in the context of his culture. And you really men were not allowed to talk to women in public, and certainly not to touch women. And they were not to be included in the religious discussions. And he did all of those things.
Yes.
And his disciples were shocked by it. When they came back and he's talking to the woman at the well, they're shocked that he's doing that. That's the first thing that's wrong. He's breaking the cultural taboo of his time, and thereby suggesting that those taboos are not the final way of looking at human interactions. So he was a radical figure in his own culture and moved way beyond what other people were doing at that time. And I think that's what you have to feel that, or know the historical situation, I think, as you well pointed out. Someone has said that it's like Jesus gave this great thrust towards liberation, and it's contained, the seeds are there, and if you would just follow it out, you would get this whole breakdown of a distinction between Jews and Gentiles, which actually happened, but you'd also get a breakdown in the divisions between races and between males and females. But what has happened historically is that has sort of run out of gas, that great thrust that was in Jesus, that really revolutionary, radical thrust to break down barriers, was lost in one way or another.
It went only so far, and as you said, it sort of stopped there.
And people often accuse Paul, I guess, as you said, of being one of the persons who was responsible for this. I want to pick up on something else that you said about Luke's gospel. It's interesting, but Luke is tremendous for women, because he often parallels men's stories with women's stories, and so that the woman finds the coin that was lost in the house to make a point, along with the male story, the counterpoint of that. And I think that the women are helping Jesus in the Passion and so on, and then the idea of the witnesses to that, and the great prominence of Mary in the thing, that the Annunciation is made to Mary, and so on, and not to Joseph as we find it in Matthew's Gospel. So that you've got in Luke this attempt, it appears to be conscious. If you start looking for it, it looks to me at least, and speaking not as a biblical scholar, but I think I've heard this said by biblical scholars, that you begin to pick up a pattern, that it almost looks like he on purpose included women as the witnesses to what Jesus was done, and put the women's stories in next to the stories of men, so you have in the Anna in the temple as well. Yes. Which is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that is interesting, that in a way the women before Jesus, or at the point of his birth before he was born, women are already his disciples in a way. Mary is his disciple. Elizabeth, immediately recognizing the mother of my Savior, I think she says. She is announcing Jesus' presence already, and also Anna. The very openness of these women, they must have been very in touch with a spiritual life, and searching for this. It took a tremendous, I'm sure it took a tremendous strength to do these things. They were not manipulated into these situations. I think Mary has become too much of kind of a holy card figure at times, very much a plaster person. I think of her as being somewhat spiritually liberated, at least, that she could really interact with God in this way. Perhaps Jesus images Mary. Here's a person who can say yes to God. Her son Jesus is the person who can say yes to God. It's kind of a... I thought of that recently.
Andrew Greeley, in his book on the Mary myth, argues that we know a lot about Mary from looking at Jesus, that the son somehow reflects the mother, and that we know a lot about Mary and what a great person she must have been precisely from looking at Jesus, the way he turned out, and the way he was able to respond to life. I find that to be an interesting mode of arguing. I don't know how much weight I want to put on it, but it is suggestive anyway, I think, in a way of looking at it.
And in John's Gospel, she would be the one to kind of push him to begin his public life.
That's right, so, at the story of Cana.
Right, so she is involved, of course, too.
Susan, we ought to look more at the contemporary situation in talking about the ordination of women. You know you're in a cause you're not going to see results very quickly, don't you? I mean, we're in a situation we're not going to start ordaining women in the Catholic Church tomorrow, and I wouldn't look for it in the lifetime, or I wouldn't look for it in the lifetime of our present Pope, because he is very, I think, opposed to that kind of notion. That's just not going to happen. I think it's interesting to note that we do see women being ordained in other churches.
Yes.
I think of a student of mine at Bowling Green who went on to do her graduate studies at Berkeley, a Lutheran young woman, and eventually was called to a parish and was ordained, although it's also important to note that it took her a long time to get that call. It was not easy for her to find a parish that really wanted her, and she couldn't be ordained in the Lutheran tradition until that occurred. But so we have Lutherans ordaining women, and we have our Episcopalian friends in the United States ordaining women. So there are precedents for all of this.
Yes.
We also should note that there are many groups very strongly opposed to this. The Orthodox Christians, for example, I think are not big on women's ordination at all. And some people feel that, well, the Catholic Church has its tightest links with the Orthodox Church, and that therefore we should not ordain women, because if we did, we would put a roadblock on the way of eventual unity with the Orthodox, which just might be one of the grand plans of our present Pope, to try to accomplish that thing. So we got to remember that there's people arguing on both sides of this question, and the activity is on both sides. Some Christian groups doing the ordination of women, others very much opposed to it.
Yes, well, first of all, I think that while you may be right, possibly we won't see this in our lifetime. I don't like to say that because I think that allows people to not do anything about it. You know, they could say, it will come someday, but not in my lifetime, is a way of not having to think about it too much, you know, not having to work for it. So I'm hopeful that it will come in our lifetimes.
Yeah, I guess I don't remember how I said it exactly. I think in the lifetime of our Pope, I think is
right.
what I said.
Yes.
I can't
okay.
imagine that
Well,
happening.
other people have said, you know, it's fine. And, well, in fact, a friend who said she's talked about this with her high school students, and they said, well, yes, we probably should do this, but it probably won't happen in our lifetimes, is a way of them not having to make any commitment one way or another on the issue, really.
I see what you're saying, and I'm thinking about the surprising things that happen in the church.
Yes.
The example that comes to my mind was that in the early 60s, you could not get an article published in a Catholic publication suggesting, just suggesting that the Mass, or the canon of the Mass, be in English. You could not get that. And within that decade, it actually wasn't just talked about anymore, it actually was done. Where the Eucharistic prayer, the canon of the Mass, the central important part, was actually in English or the vernacular around the world. That is remarkable change that occurred in that one decade. So maybe one has to be open to the surprising things that the Spirit does in the world. But I guess I do when I talk to women's groups on this topic. I often try to insist on a certain realism involved, that if you're going to be involved in a struggle, you can't expect easy results. And I really don't think myself that we're going to see it in the lifetime of this Pope. It just, his own mindset is so opposed to that kind of thing.
Well, I think that may be true. He does not seem to be in favor at all of this sort of thing, so it's probably unlikely, unless, as we say, the Spirit works in mysterious ways and something would happen. Going along with what some of the other churches are doing, or whether we should not ordain women because of possible unity, disunity, I think ecumenism is very good, but I'm not sure that we should push for unity at the sake of any things that might be just to do. And I think we have to recognize that there may be people who would have difficulty seeing a woman priest. I wouldn't have that difficulty, and I might find myself very irritated at their difficulty, but I can, in some sense, try to understand that that's there. On the other hand, there are people being alienated now because there are not women priests. I really wonder what some of the young women think of their religion when they realize now that many other things are open to women, that they can be free to be you and me, to use that little song, but yet in the church, no, they're not free to be you and me. They can't be altar girls. They maybe could lector or distribute communion, but beyond that, limited possibilities, really. What is the use of sticking with a church that doesn't seem to really want you fully? And so I think we may be alienating some of our young people, probably even the men, the young men.
I was in a discussion, Susan, the other day with two young women who are they're catechumens and going to join the Catholic community soon, and we were talking about confession, and they said they really would like to be able to go to confession to a woman, that they thought women would understand their particular problems much better, and that they thought it was a terrible thing that they wouldn't have that opportunity. So that probably exemplifies the point you were just making, that some people feel diminished or impoverished or put upon because they don't have the ministry of women.
Yes.
That is one of my own ideas.
Yes.
I think that the whole community suffers because we don't have women ordained priests. We're walking around saying that we don't have enough priests, and the simple solution is that half the population is excluded from it. We would solve our problems tomorrow in terms of the number of clergy if we allowed women to be ordained. And my own position is there is no theological, biblical reason why they shouldn't be ordained. And my own position is that someday they will be ordained, because no restrictive law that doesn't have normative backing is ever going to be carried through in an age of liberation. Sooner or later, that will happen. And I think it would be to our great credit if we could lead the way on that question and not just lag behind.
I think you're right. I don't want to be put in the position of saying that women need other women because they cannot at all communicate with men, but I think that by having both sexes in the ministry, we create more a fullness that's not there by having only one sex there. I'm certain that I do communicate with some men, and there are some women I do not communicate with. So it's not simply that they're a woman, but that there's a fullness created by having men and women there. I was in a retreat group movement in my parish for a while, and we did retreats in which the team of lay women would set up the next retreat. And that was a powerful experience because we really ministered to each other, and I think we found we had been missing some things.
Mm-hmm. I like your idea of fullness, Susan. I think that probably captures a lot of what we're after here, that the women's experience would be brought to bear on the whole community from a position of leadership. It would become more visible and a more credible kind of sign, I think, of the fullness of human experience. Well, we've been talking about women's ordination. So many more questions could be raised. I guess I think myself there's no real biblical basis for excluding women, and I think that we as a community would be greatly enriched if we had that kind of experience. And also we would do better in terms of numerically of having more people available to be the official leaders in the church. Susan, I like the thoughtful and careful way that you phrase things, and I really wish your group well, and I hope that other people will get involved in this important cause.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Susan Haar, a freelance writer and teacher at Owens Technical College and at Lourdes College. The topic of this week's reflections was the ordination of women. If you have any questions about today's program or have any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio, 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network.